Great. I think we'll get started. So thank you everyone for joining us for the first conversation in this year's Emily Hall Tremaine Fellowship for Curators, Journalism Fellowship for Curators. This project, we bring in curators that can talk about their work, and we sort of encourage them to post about it, or at least I should say, to organize an online exhibition that sort of pushes their own practice as curators, but also, introduces a number of topics that aren't traditionally or maybe historically discussed in the art world in new and interesting ways. So we're very lucky to have Álvaro Ibarra, who's assistant professor of art history at Utah State University, and who writes and curates about Mexican modernism and Latinx art. His scholarly writings and archaeological projects engage marginalia in ancient Rome, and he also publishes on classical tradition in film and video games. Wow, that's quite a broad range of material, Álvaro. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you got to this. I mean, that's a pretty, extensive range, from marginalia in ancient Rome to classical tradition in video games and Latinx modernism. I mean, that's quite a wide range. Can you tell us a little bit about what connects all those things for you?
Sure. I think it goes kind of in both directions. In the sense, I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, on the U.S.-Mexico border, and when I was going to school and first started studying art history, right, they threw these words at me like hybridity and liminality, and all these sort of fancy words for what I figured. Well, I know what this is. I know what you're talking about. I live this. And so, yeah, when I ended up going to grad school, decided I want to do art history, art criticism, something, along those lines. I was doing, at that point, what we used to call Mexican American studies, Chicano studies. But I really, in my heart of hearts, I had this longing for doing antiquity, and for doing in particular ancient Rome, and it maybe it was part of my upbringing or whatever it was. It just felt like Italy and ancient Rome was about as far away as I could possibly get from where I grew up, and there was this sort of escapist element, to my desire to do that. But interestingly enough, once I started being a Romanist, it all came full circle, because I ended up mostly working on Roman provincial, marginalia, talking about people on, outsiders of, within the Roman world. And so, yeah, a lot of the stuff that I learned about hybridity and liminality and code switching and all this sort of stuff, became applicable in my archaeological work out in the provinces. And then, it kind of goes in cycles, I guess. I go from being an archaeologist to being a critic to being an art historian. I don't know if you can do it all at once, but one tries.
Right. Yeah. So in this project, you're focusing on paño arte, or artepaño. Is that correct? Now, do you want to distinguish between those two? In your articles, you go into it beautifully. But for those who may not understand how you're defining those two topics, and maybe even defining what paño means for people who may not know.
Sure. I mean, simply enough, a paño is a handkerchief, but it is transformed, by the artist into paño arte, right, into a work of art. They draw on it, usually with ink. That's usually the primary medium, so ink on cotton. But I make a distinction between what a lot of artists have come to call paño arte, which is just the act, the materiality of it. This is what it is. Here it is, in front of you. It's a work of art on a handkerchief, as opposed to what I'm calling artepaño, which is really giving sense to a tradition, to give it a sort of importance beyond, again, to elevate it beyond it being something like a craft, right, which is easily dismissed, right? This should be up there, as a tradition, in the same way that you would talk about, surrealism, or the same way that you would talk about, those kind of movements and traditions in the canon of art history. So it's a way of elevating it to give it, to give it the respect it deserves.
Absolutely. So I just want to remind people that we're accepting questions. So if there are anything you'd like to bring up in the course of our conversation, feel free to insert it in the chat, and we'll try to integrate it into the conversation and we keep going. So now, some of the things that you went into that I thought was really interesting in this series was also some of the copyright issues around this art, around the issues of ownership, because of course these are federal property, or at least this sort of the way. Do you want to talk a little bit about how this is different from other kinds of work being created, or some of the challenges as a curator you face, or as an art historian you face with this material? Because a lot of them don't have a recorded artist associated with them. A lot of them aren't, it's not quite clear where they were created, the conditions they were created under. So how do you parse all that?
It's a very difficult situation in the sense of, you want to recognize the artists, you want to give them, the right to say this is my work of art. But the big problem is, these artifacts, have a way of getting lost and of moving around, and some of it has to do with their origins, right? A lot of this, these are artworks that are coming from prisoners, in some cases, depending on the time, depending on the place, they are legally allowed to make these and to mail them to the recipients. In certain historical contexts, they were smuggled out, and they made their way, through the mail to the recipients. And so in that sense, they are kind of illicit objects in a sort of bizarre way. But the other thing, of course, is that, as I said in one of the articles, was that there's no point of pride in displaying, these objects. There's been a changing sentiment to that recently, but back when I was growing up, you saw these things, you'd sort of stumble across these things, and in somebody's cupboard or something like that, because of course there was no point of pride in saying that one of your loved ones was in the Huntsville Penitentiary or whatever. They were kept, but they were not displayed. They were not, and so they kind of have a way of making their way into the art world, through various avenues. Usually it's people just giving away a bunch of linens, and within those linens you'll have a paño that they didn't know was hidden in there, and then it makes its way into the Goodwill, or to Salvation Army and that kind of stuff, and then it gets picked up by artists, or by other kind of collectors that are looking for, think that they've sort of stumbled upon some kind of prize or something really interesting, and they have, to a certain extent, and then they end up on eBay, they end up in all kinds of folk art auctions and all kinds of things, and so it gets really hazy really fast, as far as you're talking about like who made it, as opposed to who has it now, and who owns it, and that's where things become really muddy and contentious.
Right. Absolutely. Well, some of the conversations I was having around this, because I have to say, when you first presented this project, I was really fascinated, because I was like, oh, I wonder what's been done, or how these works circulate, or how they come out. And one person I actually messaged on eBay who was selling them said that he would receive them when he would send money to this prisoner. And this was a thank you for the money they sent, for their books, they called it. I don't know the term, but it's just, so it was so interesting to see how there are so many ways that these things circulated, and for various reasons, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and the issue with, as far as ownership and all that sort of stuff, is that laws insofar as prisoner rights are concerned, and their rights to property and ownership and all this kind of stuff. And especially as our prison system becomes more privatized, um, the laws are inconsistent, their application, their enforcement. Some prisons will allow them to do this, others won't. Again, it's so up in the air, as far as how these artists are able to express themselves, and whether they're able to, again, put their artwork out there publicly, or whether they're denied to do any of this kind of stuff. Yeah, the inconsistency is what is a huge problem, and it shouldn't be a problem, in the sense that, shouldn't we treat all prisoners across the United States in a very particular sort of way? It should be sort of very clear-cut laws, and enforcement of those laws, but here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm putting in the chat for everyone the articles if they haven't seen the articles yet. A lot of the names we're saying are there because there was someone who asked about the names. Also, Teddy Vardell is answering. We can ask live. He says, "Will you address works made for the market rather than family?" So, are works made for the market by these people who are imprisoned, or are these all? Is this just for that private sort of consumption?
I think increasingly, yes. Um, I remember a couple of years ago there was a New York Times article, about the connection between some New York galleries, and prisoners and the prison system. So increasingly, yeah, there are some prisoners that are making this for galleries, that are making this for the market. But ultimately, the reason why that is because the prison system, or someone within the prison system, has realized that they can make some money off of this. And so it's for profit. So the prisoner, maybe he gets some percentage of it, who knows. Again, all this stuff, like I was saying earlier, is kind of up in the air because of all the privatization, and because of the inconsistency in the enforcement, and also because this is kind of new, where they're realizing, oh, we can kind of make some money off of this. So yeah, make your art, and we'll cut a deal, with some fancy New York gallery, and and we'll sell your stuff at high end prices. And again, I don't know how it wasn't disclosed how much the prisoners are making, off of their art. So increasingly, yes, there are some places that are making art for the market, or some kind of marketability, as opposed to just family. It's kind of a recent thing, not to say that it didn't happen in the past, but now it's starting to become known, that these are artifacts, objects that people desire.
Absolutely. So perhaps we can look at the exhibition now, so that we can talk a little bit about that, because at the end of the day, we want to talk about the art and sort of a little bit of that. So let me just do this for a second. Okay. So here we see the exhibition. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you chose to sort of organize this exhibition, this online exhibition, and then we can scroll through and talk about some of the panels and some of your choices.
Um, as you know, I went through a couple of different iterations of what this might look like, but I have to give every credit to my friend James Lawrence, um, for suggesting epistolary, because I was struggling with the format, and and after the first two articles, I didn't want to make something that was kind of like overly preachy and pedantic, um, and he said, well, it's an email exhibition. He said, well, email, like all mail, it's sort of equal parts intimate and distant. So just write letters, and it just made sense. And once I started writing them, it was a pretty quick process.
Absolutely. Someone's saying the exhibition is not showing. It's actually, we're just at the top in the introductory text, but also if you can't see it, in the link that I posted in the chat, there, if you click on there, it's the Artepaño dispatches from the US carceral system. So you can scroll it at home as well. So just FYI. So what I liked about this format that I thought really worked well was the fact that you brought in the sort of like, this is only half of a conversation. these sort of paños like are only half where the other part are where they're getting what they're getting back from people. And you sort of like close the loop a little bit. So what, how did you get some of these letters, first of all? And could you tell us a little bit about how you chose to sort of pair some of these and whether they're all paired with the family or how what that looks like?
So a lot of questions. Let me
Yes,
address.
I apologize. There's a lot to talk about. A lot to talk about.
No, fantastic, fantastic. So the theme. Let's start with the sort of the overall thematic. These are not the be all end all themes, of course. These are just themes that again are the most recurrent that um, I have seen over many years. And again, this isn't just restricted to paños. It's all kinds of prison art, stuff that you find in letters, stuff that you find on envelopes, just drawings, body art, all this sort of stuff. And these are just sort of recurring themes associated with prisoners and the kind of things that they are interested in, the kind of things that they want to talk about, and where it's coming from is just from just many years of growing up in this culture in South Texas for the most part. I mean, it's if you read it, you see it's very South Texas. It's very regionalized. So again, I'm not trying to pretend that this is global or in any sort of fashion, but nevertheless, this is the kind of stuff that you just encountered over and over and over again, and just in conversations and just in being in that culture and knowing these kind of guys, when in some cases before they went in, when they were in, when they came out, and again, it's just again, they're just recurring elements. Now, please remind me, what was the other question?
Oh, there's so many questions, I know, but I guess we can go through them one by one. So we'll go through them. But it just another question that came up when you're saying that: are there certain prisons known for this more than others? Are there certain institutions where this is sort of something that more prisoners are engaged in?
I'm most familiar with the stuff coming out of Huntsville, just because that's the big state penitentiary in Texas. And but there's another one that's escaping me at the moment out of San Antonio, Bexar County, which in particular had an arts program that was very um, successful, I would say, where a lot of this stuff has come from. It's still coming out because again, you get little bits of it, over the decades. You don't, some of this stuff is, might still be in someone's linen closet.
Right.
But yeah, mostly Huntsville, and a lot of it has to do in the mid to late '90s. Governor Ann Richards at the time in Texas, she gave a lot of money towards rehabilitation programs, and some of those programs included art rehabilitation, and so that's where a lot of these baños were coming from. That's why you get a lot of them from the mid to late '90s. And then when George W. Bush came in and he became governor of Texas, he did away with most of those programs, and had this sort of tough on crime. Why are we letting prisoners draw and do stuff like that? And so they did away with those programs, and so for a while you kind of get this this dip in production, until more recently we're starting to get again. It might have something to do with the privatization of the prison systems, where they're not again consistent in whether they're allowing prisoners, whether this is something that they should be allowed to do or not allowed to do, and there's debate and differing opinions on that sort of stuff depending on who you talk to.
Absolutely. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here? I have to say, this is quite brilliantly done. I mean, the material, the different imagery, the sort of the pop culture, but also the historic, like there's a nice like blend of all those types of things, and just the quality of the drawing. It's really interesting. What can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this one? What you think it's sort of representative of it, and how you chose to pair this with this letter?
Yeah, a couple different things here. Um, I like the quality of a lot of these paños have what you might call a kind of horror vacui sort of sensibility to, just every single little corner of these things are jam packed with imagery and detail. And I think that's also revealing in the sense that, these guys got nothing but time, to fill every single bit of space, which is such intricate details. And it's sort of bittersweet in a sense that it's amazing. Yeah, they're tremendous artists, but at the same time, this is why they're able to execute on this, on this level, right? This is their therapy, if you will. But okay, so as far as what you're looking at here, Mexican pride, I started right with this theme of orgullo or pride, because one of the things that frequently comes up with regard to, kind of Latino men, that there's sort of stereotypes, right? That we're hotheads, that we're macho, that we're sexy. I'll take that one. But that we're there's a sort of vainglorious element, to our culture, to our sort of macho being as Latino men. And there's something of that here, right? There's something sort of over the top about this composition. Yes, it's very masculine. Yes, it's very kind of macho. But what's interesting is, to me, is what it's really about beneath the surface. There is something truly kind of heartbreaking about these kind of over the top, seemingly very unrepentant kind of, yeah, representations of macho-ness or whatever,
Right.
because at the end of the day, what these generally tend to be, the people who are receiving these are always a way to kind of, to bolster someone who's falling into despair. They're usually about, hey, keep your chin up, even though, like, I'm here behind bars and suffering like this, like, and it always comes along with letters that are just like, don't go the same route as me, don't do that, like, keep your chin up, have pride in yourself, have pride in your culture, all this kind of stuff. And so again, like, superficially, it seems like these are like, oh, unrepentant guys who are just, I don't know, lifelong criminals, they're never going to change. But that's not really what it's about.
Right. No, that makes sense. That's very clear. And also, as you mentioned, because they're sort of personal or intimate in nature, somebody might have it in a pocket or in a drawer or something. So there is an element of that kind of thing. And I like that you brought up the horror vacui, because that was something I definitely noticed. And it was sort of like, I wonder what speaks to the artists when they're sort of doing that. And yeah, just interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about this letter? I mean, talk about this. I think captures a little bit of what you were saying. Exactly. Like, this is where it's sort of like something where it sort of gives a little insight into the process, maybe that or the conditions that this person made this, but also a little bit about their own lives. Is this kind of the typical kind of letters you're talking about, or how would you characterize this letter?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these letters from prison, they generally tend to be very effusive. They tend to be very, um, in whatever direction, pretty emotional. It is, again, incredibly private, as are the paños for the most part, right? They're not intended for the public, even though now they've become art objects in museums and whatnot. But they are these sort of very private conversations with people. And again, it is a moment of the pinto, as the slang term is for, the Chicano prisoner, of kind of letting their guard down and sort of allowing themselves to talk about emotional things and communicate in a very emotional fashion. That, again, it's something that they are not really able to do in the context of the penitentiary, right? This is the kind of stuff that you don't put out there, right? And that's why it's very private in a lot of ways. And that's why there's, I'm torn, as I've said, between, like, should this stuff be out there? And I think it's important, and I think it's great to recognize it. But there's a part of me that says, right, this is a kind of a, like reading someone's diary or something. There's something,
Yeah.
kind of voyeuristic about it. And maybe
Yeah.
that's why
You know,
people are attracted to it.
yeah, it's interesting. When I was in Southern Ontario last fall, and there's actually one museum that has the prisoner art from the 1830s, 40s, or something to that effect in Canada that would sell to, they would send them to loved ones like this,
Mm.
like in a way. And so it's sort of interesting that there's this actually long history of those that are incarcerated to sort of sending these kinds of mementos to loved ones, which I thought was really interesting too. Now, are there artists that are sort of best known out of this, like that people that like built reputations around this, or that are sort of sought out by others? Are these some of the artists, or have you heard about that, or do they leave prison perhaps doing art or anything to that effect? Does that happen, or maybe tattooing or one of these adjacent sort of professions?
Yeah, they do come out, and a lot of times they started off as tattoo artists, and this is just something adjacent, to the to their talent. Um, but yeah, I mean, I could imagine that they come out and they do tattoos, and that's a sort of line of work that they go into. But I haven't heard of any of these artists sort of becoming sort of famous for this or sought after for this. And again, because a lot of the stuff that I work with is kind of, almost archival, right? It is, from a certain time period. So again, I'm not looking at the stuff that's like on eBay right now, or if they're like, if so and so artist has a, has a following on eBay or something like that. I'm kind of looking at this, in a kind of time capsule from a certain time and place. So I wouldn't be surprised, but honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to tell us a little bit about this pairing in Under Wasted Time with the actual, I guess, separation papers or divorce papers?
Uh, yeah, tirando tiempo, which is what they call, being in prison is tirando tiempo. You are literally throwing your time in the garbage, right? It is worthless, pointless. And during this time, right, when you're a prisoner and when they're tirando tiempo, they obsess, right? They obsess about the things that they are missing. They're not living life. They're in this kind of limbo between life and death, right? Which is how sometimes they express being in prison. And there is a kind of almost like psychedelic element to like the memories that they have, and trying to put that down, to concretize these emotions that they're feeling into their artwork. And this is kind of what you're seeing here. That's why there is this sort of strange element, when you're looking behind the artist. I mean, the artist is Rosendo, but you don't know if he's depicting himself. um, maybe, but you can see behind him, these women that he's thinking about, he's dreaming about, he's worried about them, but it's hard to sort of pinpoint, you know,
Yeah,
what, what it is exactly that, the only thing that really comes across is the passage of time,
right.
right? That he's losing it, right? You see the pages, the years, of the calendar flipping by, but everything else is just kind of, again, sort of nebulous. And so, yeah, and one of the things, of course, that they obsess about is their loved ones, their family, their in particular for these guys, their wives or girlfriends, whether they're, you know, gonna stick with them, uh, while they're behind bars. And yeah, on top of all, the letters that they might receive from loved ones, and, some of the letters that they receive are divorce papers.
Right. Right. Makes sense. And in this one, I particularly like that. So you're not quite clear who these people are. Is it the same person three times at the top? Is it three different women? It's not quite clear. And I like that ambiguity too, because it's sort of like, it sort of invites you to sort of figure out and decode. And you talk about the decoding, that seems to be a common thing that people want to do with these. In general, they're decoded, or like try to figure out what they might denote, because there is actual real world implications for some of that imagery you mentioned. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and
Sure. I was going to say, potentially this means something very, very specific to both the artist and to the person who received this. What it means to us, it's completely lost. Again, like you were saying, who are these women? What is, do they have anything to do with each other? Or, are these, yeah, we have no idea as to their identity. And I think the blurring is intended. If you look at it, it's something that comes up again and again and again in paños. You see these sort of funny little bubbles that you see
oh yeah,
behind
yeah.
the women, and this is a kind of dreamscape. I,
Oh,
and I don't know why these little globular, why that's what it means, and I don't know where it comes from. Maybe like thought bubbles or something. I'm not exactly sure. So it's meant to be, yeah, nebulous. It's meant to be like a blurring of the boundary, and it's also one of the things that, when you're behind bars for so long, right? Things start to kind of mush together, and time and memories, and you start to misremember things. Was that, I don't know, maybe he's saying, was that girlfriend or that girlfriend or all of the girlfriends that he's missing right now while he's imprisoned.
absolutely. And that the image for me is the most interesting is that little what I figured out was a heart between the two figures on the right, and it's sort of, they looked like eggs initially, and I couldn't figure out, but I don't quite figure out how they're being wrapped. And I like that this sort of, there's clearly something very personal there that it's not quite 100% clear.
Do you mean the shoulders?
Is that what it is? Oh, because it looks like a heart to me now. It looked like a heart because it sort of seemed like an odd position for the shoulder. That
I
makes
don't
more sense now.
I don't think the artist would mind that interpretation, but it is this kind of coy, coquette kind of, the shoulder up to the chin.
Oh, that's what it. See, there we are. So you helped me decipher that one.
And
Because
you
I
can
was
see
like, I
the,
don't quite understand where that was coming. At first, I thought they were eggs or something else. So, okay, a couple of questions we have here. Karen actually, oh, this is nice. She mentions, Karen Christensen mentions the letters changed how she looked at the paños, and that they added such depth. Did you match the letter to the art, or was it for the art from the artist initially?
but no, the letters are entirely my fabrication, but and inspired by the artwork. But at the same time, they are based on, again, letters, communications, conversations, uh, being amongst these kind of guys growing up. So yeah, they're kind of sort of not biographical, but certainly stemming from, my own experiences and, with these guys and stuff.
Absolutely. And then we have a question from Anne Maureen McKetting. I'll just answer it because it was something I mentioned. She asking about those boxes in Southern Ontario. They were actually from the Upper Canada Rebellion, and they were at Sharon Temple in Sharon, Ontario. Just so you know, there wasn't an exhibition, but they were sort of in the collection there. So let's keep going. Now, fandom. This one I think feels very relatable for a lot of people because this feels very, the type of thing one would expect to see. But can you talk a little bit about this as well as sort of the pairing with the letter itself?
Yeah, of course. Selena Quintanilla, Tejano Star, La Reina, La Diosa, much beloved, tragic figure, Tejano Star, that was murdered in 1995, just as she was going to be this big crossover mega star. And she's become this sort of, you know, saint of South Texas. And so, yeah, I mean, the fandom, people across the board, forget about just, people behind bars, but certainly even there, which I think it's important. There's this sort of sensibility or this belief, I guess, that, people behind bars are somehow like cloistered, that they're just completely separated from what's going on in the outside world, that they don't know what's going on, that they're going to, get out of prison, wearing bell-bottom jeans and just this sort of ridiculous sort of understanding of like prison being this sort of cloistered space where, yeah, they do hear news and they do know what's going on. And one of the things, of course, is like Tejano culture, which happened, of course, in the 90s, through the 90s, where, there was a kind of push against, the whole Chicano West Coast, kind of Southwest, and, Texas Latinos started, creating their own kind of identity of being Tejano. And some of these, and the music, was a huge part of it. And so even sort of behind bars, these guys learned about, artists like Selena, and they become fans, and they become, and again, part of it might be, like I said, all you got is time, right? They become like mega fans, they become super, into the music and the, all that kind of stuff. And so here's just sort of an example of that kind of fandom, which is, again, it's a way of connecting to the outside world, connecting to their relatives, who might like this music and that kind of thing. Again, just feeling like you're still salient, even while you're, behind bars, feeling like, you still matter to these people, and you still have something to say about their interests and their, their loves. And that's, I really like this one because it's Jennifer Lopez as Selena, because there was a big, big hubbub, a big problem with Jennifer Lopez portraying Selena Quintanilla because she's Puerto Rican. She's not, she's not Chicana, she's not Tejana. And I was like, oh, get over it. But this is nice because it's kind of yeah, she did a good job. Yeah, she did. She did a nice job playing Selena.
Have you been able to connect with a lot of families that have collections of these, or like from their own family members or something like that? Or does it tend to be more when it gets to institutions or outside of that context where you encounter them?
It's mostly been institutional, as opposed to the stuff that I did growing up, kind of stumbled onto from time to time, and then, in that sense, it's sort of awkward. You don't really talk about it. It's just, it's like, oh, I didn't know. Oh, let's move on to a different conversation. But no, it's mostly stuff that is in collections, that are collectors that have approached me. In particular, the one that I've been working with, who is Reno Leplat Torti, who's a French collector who kind of stumbled, upon these back in 2008, I think he told me, and has now amassed the largest collection, as far as I know, of these baños in the world. I think he has something upwards of 800 baños right now, and they're all incredibly diverse. And all of these, come from his collection, as you can see. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm encountering it, and I'm trying to keep it from that perspective, with the exception of this little project. Again, I'm trying to promote this idea of Artepaño, right?
Yeah.
To what do we do with these things now that they are kind of art objects, now that they are museum artifacts, now that they are kind of divorced from their original context. And so, yeah, in that sense, I kind of keep it kind of separate.
Yeah, one thing I loved about this letter was it also mentions the fact that perhaps people were sending work by other prisoners or something, like, so they weren't necessarily making it themselves. They were sort of, maybe commissioning or getting it from others as well. Um, is that common? Is that something you saw that was a common thing?
Used to be, again, because of all the weird vacillations with the prison system right now, it's hard to say. But back in the day, certainly back in the 90s in Texas, yeah, absolutely. They were being commissioned to make these works of art. And they would exchange it for whatever, whatever they needed behind bars. And so they would make, baños, they would make drawings, they'd make highly decorated envelopes, that they would sort of, again, trade for something or another, for, as you might imagine. So yeah, this was, and these guys were, were kind of a valuable members of their prison community. You know, people would look up to them. They thought they were, again, talented, that they had, you know, that they were, again, in the same way that we, you know, lionize artists, right? In our contemporary world, that we think of them as special. We think of them as seeing the world in a different way. We think of them as being able to communicate in ways that we can't. And so again, yeah, in that way, within the prison system, among, you know, their fellows, yeah, they're thought of as being special people. Um, so yeah, very common. Used to be.
Yeah, and this is lovely. Out of curiosity, only having studied a little bit of Soviet prison art, there was actually pornography was very common in some of that prison art. Was that something that also exists in this work?
Um, I wouldn't, not to say that it doesn't exist, but I think that, you know, most of the stuff that's making its way out, you know, to family and friends and things like that, there is some stuff that you might say is kind of raunchy. Yeah, I mean, as you saw, you know, beautiful women with their breasts, you know, prominently displayed, and you know, stuff like that, is fairly common. But as far as pornographic, again, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I haven't come across it. Again, stuff that's a little blue, yeah, maybe, but not.
Gotcha, gotcha. And this is a good example of sort of the fandom you're talking about. Do you want to just comment on this, maybe the letter a little bit, to kind of a little bit of what you were trying to communicate?
Sure. As you were talking about earlier, this is kind of closing the loop, whereas most of these are right from the perspective of the prisoner speaking, but this is kind of coming from the other side, which again is kind of from, you know, the experience of being around those family members who, you know, their dad, their uncle, whatever, you know, is behind bars, and they're, you know, exchanging letters and, you know, this kind of stuff. And, you know, there's something about the kind of very mundane little things about everyday life that becomes so incredibly important when you're, you know, when you're communicating to someone behind bars, and even to them, like these little tidbits of news are just so incredibly important, you know, to them, and they just like memorize it, and it becomes, you know, it takes on a life of its own, these kind of communications. um, so that's kind of what I was getting at. And you know, this sort of, you know, how, you know, sad, you know, of course, that a kid is without his dad and is still at the age, of course, at that particular age, as I remember, right, that kind of hero worship that you still have, right, for your father figure. And you know, and yeah, it's kind of where I was coming from.
Yeah. And then this one's really moving, and the letter just broke my heart. Just sort of the way it sort of tells the story. You know, are these two connected at all? Because I mean, it just this pairing is just so beautifully done. I had to wonder. I was like, are these actually the same people? They're not, are they?
No, not at all. But again, it you know, I also made that sort of connection in my
Yeah,
own,
absolutely.
and I'm glad that it came across. I'm glad that
Yeah.
that you saw that.
No, absolutely. I feel like it sort of told the story for its, you know, it was like, I was like, oh, my heart's breaking. You know, it's like, it's sort of like into this. And I think that's where the letter format really works well. Now, is this format this sort of, tell us a little bit about this, because it's actually a very interesting drawing, but at the same time, it's sort of like, you know, I'm like, they're not smiling. It's sort of very solemn. And I'm kind of curious where that's coming from, or where, you know, how you would read this image.
I think this is very kind of typical Chicano sort of presentation, you know, of self. This sort of very stoic, very, you know, stern, you know, not big smiles or that sort of thing.
A
Uh,
formal portrait or something.
yeah, exactly. I don't know why it kind of permeates, but I've seen so many, again, just pictures, you know, family photos and whatever with these uncles and these father figures and these whatever, you know, just having the same, you know, look, this very stern, you know, kind of face that they put on. And sometimes the woman can have it too, but she's kind of allowed to smile a little bit. You know, but not him, right? He's strong. He's, you know, all this sort of thing that you're that you're presenting, right? I think it's an understanding of what a photo is supposed to be as a kind of document, right? And I think maybe it's because, you know, growing up, we didn't have a lot of photos taken
Right.
of us, you know, growing up, because it was film, or because, you know, you only took photos when it was something important. There was some, you know, an important event or something like that. And you had to, again, you were putting forth a kind of presentation, right? It's a representation of how you want people to perceive you, to see you, to understand you, as opposed to now, right, where it's all just very frivolous because we can just take a million pictures and it doesn't matter. But this is like, again, like very posed and staged, and again, it probably, as I say here, was probably coming off of some old Polaroid that was taken
Right.
of him and his wife or
Right.
girlfriend or whatever back in the day that he stashed away somewhere.
They look like they're coming from a fancy party or on their way to a fancy party, maybe. But I also love this sort of radiating background.
Yes,
You
which is
know, which I think is so
which
great.
is
You know,
which is
yeah,
wild, and it's kind of rare. Rare in the sense of, again, like colors. It's harder to get a hold of color pencils and this kind of stuff. So this is, you know, a big endeavor for this artist. You don't get a hold of these kind of color pencils, and if you do, it's kind of rare, and you know, and you're using them up, making this like gigantic, you know, expression of color, this whole big, you know, colorful design. So yeah, so this would have been something, I mean, if you could call it that, you know, expensive. This would have been something
yeah. And
valuable.
how much of the art is from men in prison or male identifying people, and how much are women? And is there anything? Is there a is I don't know, maybe it doesn't exist in women's prisons.
It has to, but everything that I've encountered has just been by men, and again, this probably has to do with, again, the context and where I'm kind of looking for this stuff. Of course, there has to be women banyo artists.
Sure.
I just don't know very much about them. I'd like to know more about them. If anybody knows more about them, please, you know, please communicate with me.
Please, that would be great. Yeah, I mean, these. I think one of the things about these curatorial projects that I really love is it's an opportunity for people to also contribute and give some feedback for this. So if anybody does, please feel free to reach out, or connect with Alvaro, or I can. If you send an email to Hyperallergic, we can always forward it. I think this image also captures what you were saying about the intimate nature, because you could see how this would be something your loved one would receive and sort of keep in their pocket, or like on the nights where they're missing you, or like unfurl in this kind of way, or put on their wall or something. Like this has that, really communicates that really well.
Yeah, I think there's a real performative element, you know, to this stuff. At least the intended, you know, element. I always, or even some of them communicating, like making these drawings. I call them a second skin. I call them, you know, in the same way that, you know, they tattoo, you know, their skin with all these symbols, and here the baño. There's something about the baño, about the tactility of it, the, you know, the softness of it, the, you know, the kind of, there's something akin to, you know, to the actual flesh, you know, of the absent pinto, of the absent prisoner, that is presented before, you know, their loved one, their girlfriend, their wife, whatever, and, you know, holding that soft, you know, that tissue, kind of almost, again, kind of skin like, you
Yeah.
know, element that, you know, these guys imagine, you know, whether it's a fantasy or not, right? Imagine their girlfriends like weeping into the paño and
Right.
holding it against their breasts, and they kind of fantasize about, you know, this second skin, you know, being used, being held by their loved one in a very, again, a very performative kind of
Yeah,
way.
that's a powerful image. I'm glad you brought that up. Also, I could also see the fragility of them, right? It's sort of, there's this mortality aspect to this kind of fragile kind of image that collapses and sort of is put away, right? In the way that it doesn't, it's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, well, you know, life is fragile.
It really is. This one, I really, I love the imagery, because it feels so unusual, even though there's everything feels super familiar, but the way it's sort of put together feels a little kind of different. And also the choice of yellow, which is really kind of very stark and beautiful. Tell us a little bit about this one, and why you chose to pair it with this letter.
Um, again, for most of these men, it's about their girlfriends, their wives, their children, but oftentimes it's also about their mothers. And oftentimes there's a lot of letters, and again, just a lot of situations of these men who sometimes never make it out of prison, um, sending letters in hopes of forgiveness, in hopes of redemption, if hope, and letters that most frequently go to their mothers, asking them, forgive me for being such a bad son, forgive me for being a bad man,
Yeah.
and if and if they can only get that little bit of redemption, maybe that's something that in some cases here, the kind of implication is that this is somebody on death row.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, some good news here. Teddy Vardell is saying that he actually has an example of one by a woman artist, that he
awesome.
collected most of his in San Antonio in the 90s and he's going to look for it. So good news. See, there we are. So there is some connections being made, which I really love. So thank you, Teddy, for mentioning that. And hopefully we can connect you with Alvaro when you're
Please.
afterwards. Just feel free to email Hyperallergic and we'll make sure that your email
And,
connects.
and you can find me at Utah State.
Yeah, absolutely. So either way you prefer to do that, Teddy, that's great. Teddy had also mentioned earlier that Rosendo's work, there are a number of other examples. So I'm guessing Teddy might have some work pieces to compare their work to.
Yeah,
So
he's
great. This is why the conversations happen, right?
absolutely.
That's great.
Uh, and this, of course, the Virgen de Guadalupe, she is sort of everyone's mother, if you will.
Right, right. And this one also, the sort of the way that the figure, it's almost like, what is that particular, is it a certain type of dress or certain outfit? Like I was trying to figure out what that thing he's wearing is.
This is in reference to the legend of Juan Diego, who saw the image of the Virgin and came down, and was trying to reveal this miracle, and people wouldn't believe him, and goes back and said, take your cloak or whatever and take it before the bishop or something or other and like unveil it. And so he opens up his cloak and it's like all these roses, come out, and with an image of the Virgin is emblazoned on the cloak. And you're like, oh, it's real. It's a miracle.
Yeah, definitely.
And
Teddy's saying
and
that.
it is kind of about miracles, right? The miracle of forgiveness, of this person hoping that his mother will forgive him for his sins, and that
Yeah.
hope, and maybe the Virgin Mother will forgive him for his sins as well.
Yeah, I felt like the image also made the person seem vulnerable, like in this kind of way of sort of like, here I am before you, and I feel like that sort of really ties in. And this letter really is, very moving, this these kind of really asking for forgiveness in a way, right? And sort of saying, I'm yours and your son, and um, yeah, I curious, like now that you've sort of paired these, because haven't had a chance. I mean, I'm curious if it's revealed anything for you, or maybe an aspect of this work that you never really thought of.
I don't know. I suppose it opens up a lot of other things that I haven't addressed. But uh, for me, these were important themes, or maybe the ones that I thought would resonate with people, that they would, because again, these are about our everyday hangups and fears and emotions, and you don't have to be one of these guys to want forgiveness, or to want to connect with people over your favorite music, or all this kind of stuff. And so that's sort of why I selected those in particular, just because I thought they would resonate the most. But there's other themes that maybe were also important. But again, this is going to be we're I'm going to be playing around with this stuff for a while. So
Yeah, and then this one in the first article you published, I just want people to see these are actually three different versions of the same type of imagery, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and you can see how they're sort of being treated very differently, um, in the way they're sort of presented, the style, these art classes. Were they encouraging those in prison to sort of explore their own style? How did those work? Do you have any idea in terms of how those sort of manifested, or if they were encouraged to do a certain type of thing?
a, a lot of it is copying. You know, a lot of these artists have what they call copias. There are these books that are just drawings. They're things that are clipped out of magazines and newspapers and things like that that they just kind of use over and over and over and over and over again. And I think it's through the process that they arrive at a kind of style that they, you know, and again, it also has a lot to do with tattoo art, right? That there is a kind of look to kind of Chicano tattoo art that they're also kind of emulating. But I think with the paños, it's sort of, you know, it goes back and forth. I think a lot of these artists are sort of pushing the medium to find kind of their own voice, their own, you know, way of communicating that is kind of separate from tattoo art. I know it's related, but you can't say that it's the same thing.
Right.
Because people have said that it's just tattoos on, you know.
No, it doesn't look like tattoos. It looks different. It definitely looks like it's a different sort of thing. Here, all the material often will say ink on cotton. Now, when you say ink, do you mean like, are they ballpoint pens? Are there a certain type of ink? Like what are they actually using?
For the most part, they're big pins that they get in the commissary that they're allowed to have these little like tiny versions of them, so they don't turn them into shanks. And yeah, I mean that's basically what they're using. In some cases, yeah, they can get a hold of colored pencils. Sometimes they use all manner of crazy stuff in order to produce pigments, coffee grounds, you know, anything that can, you know, that can produce a mark. And yeah, you can tell with some of them they're using more like felt tip pens. Again, in some cases, especially when they did have art programs, they were allowed to have more materials. And so you get, you know, much more sort of diverse kind of mark making than you do. Once you get either earlier or later, you start to go back to kind of like the ballpoint pens
Yeah.
because it's not allowed to have anything else.
I also feel because of the format being square, but they have a little bit of an album aesthetic. They kind of sort of like they feel a little bit like albums sometimes, the way they're sort of layered. And here, there's another example of the bubbles you were mentioning, the stream-like bubbles that goes on. And then here we can see some other, this one we already talked about, and then this one over here, which I think is just, I mean, this,
yeah.
I have to say, this is kind of really, really moving in many ways. So who is H8 9998?
I've been trying to figure out.
Okay. Is it, do you have any idea why would that have been their own sort of number, or what any idea where that number may have come from?
Yeah, from San Quentin.
Okay, so it is their actual.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's his number somewhere in San Guidas. This guy made this fairly recently, but again, because of privacy rules or whatever, you know, you can't.
Got it. But that we, as far as we know, that could be a self-portrait in the middle.
Very, very likely.
Right. It's I have to say, it's just even the way the shirt is drawn is really so attractive and so interesting. And also just like the different makeup and the things on the women around him. It's sort of like it seems to have a very storytelling aspect, right, to this piece, maybe the more than the others.
Oh, you mean the creepy clown?
The clowns, right? The clown makeup on some of the figures all around.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme.
And how do you read into that? Like, what do you have any insight into why that is?
Yeah, and I think I buy it. You know, my colleague Ben Olguin, um, who wrote a book called you know, the Pinta, I believe it's what it was called. Olguin, he's at UC Santa Barbara, and he, you know, has worked very closely with these artists, and you know, wrote a book kind of about this culture in prison art and prison Chicano culture and all that kind of stuff. And he says it's from the Bible, and now my old priest is going to get very angry with me. I think it's out of John, but maybe it's out of Mark, where it says, you know, those who, you know, those who laugh now or cry later, or those who are, you know, jubilant now will, you know, will be in the doldrums later, you know, speaking about Christ and, you know, how important he is. And so this idea of like laugh now, cry later, has become sort of has permeated kind of Chicano culture and certainly the, this kind of world, the idea of like living, not Ricky Martin's Vida Loca, but living the actual Vida Loca, is about that, right? That you are living this kind of very risky kind of life that can be full of fun and all this, and can be very rewarding, but it's always like very short-sighted, and at some point, right, you're going to be crying later. And what happens is that gets sort of boiled down to the traditional, the Greek masks of tragedy and comedy. And you frequently see the tragedy in the comedy masks like over and over and over again, because it's that whole laugh now, cry later kind of attitude. But what's happened with the clown is that the comedic one has kind of morphed and it's kind of like broken away from the tragedy. And this is kind of a symbol of kind of, to a certain extent, of being like unrepentant, of saying like, yeah, I lived that life and that's what it is. And yeah, like kind of like forget about the tragedy, the tragic side of it, right? But in a sense, it's kind of also developed beyond that, because in this sense you have, right, these kind of like unrepentant clowns, around the sinner,
right?
And he's still sort of seeking salvation despite himself, almost, despite him saying like, I can still be a really unrepentant kind of guy, but at the end of the day, right, I guess it's about Jesus or whatever, about redemption.
Absolutely. And it's just like even some of the like other imagery, like the only figures with the eyes closed are the artist and like the Virgin and Jesus, right? Like sort of making those associations, and making those sort of subconscious and different sort of associations visually.
Yes.
I think is really powerful, especially since eyes are so prominent in here in the composition. So it's sort of like that's what I mean. Like there are these aspects that sort of come out as you look at them more and more, revealing themselves, which are really beautiful. I also want to mention that Martha Henry mentioned that Phyllis Cornfield, the author of Cell Block Visions, exhibited envelopes by female artists at the Outsider Art Fair many years ago. And then Martha also mentions that they have examples of Rosendo's work too. So I love that maybe there's
Awesome.
someone else. So pleased to reach out and couldn't reach out, and you guys can talk about that. And then Victoria Hamlin is asking if you can talk a little bit about how these are fetishized. And I'm guessing that means fetishized, whether it's in the collector community, but also just like in general in our culture, perhaps how they become fetishized.
Yeah, I mean, I think prison culture just kind of in general has been fetishized, and not to put it entirely on film, but I think cinema has a lot to do with it. How many people have you run into who say that, I don't know, Cool Hand Luke or The Shawshank Redemption is their favorite movie ever. And I think part of it comes from that. I think part of it comes from a kind of cinematic vision of being in prison, because again, like how many people really experience that percentage wise, right, per capita? It's still happily a relatively small percentage of of the country, but nevertheless we have lots and lots of movies about prison or about gangsters or about that that sort of crazy life, if you will. And yeah, I think that's part of the fetishization of thinking there's something kind of cool about it. There's something kind of alluring, and it's also expressed by these artists and by their artwork, right? That's the whole Vida Loca, right? The whole idea is like, this is alluring. This is a kind of life that I want to live, but there's consequences to it. Whereas if we're only enjoying it via media, via movie or via artwork, there's no real consequences to us, right? We can enjoy it without really, having to go to prison or having to live, having to, suffer the consequences of that. So yeah, I think some of it is coming from cinema. I think, but and yeah, it becomes a fetish, and that's what I'm kind of trying to fight with Artepaño, in transforming it into an art object as opposed to a fetish object, where people, a lot of collectors, unlike Renault, but other collectors, right? They come across this stuff and it becomes a fetish object. It's like, oh, isn't this cool? Isn't it somebody in prison, made this, and and I own it now. And, until the fetish, wears away and it ends up in a museum. It ends up in on eBay. It ends up, in an auction. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, like I said, has to do with cinema, has to do with media, and this is a medium, right? Artepaño, or paño arte, I should say, is a medium expressing this world and this life. But hopefully, we can transform it into artepaño and respect, these guys as artists, not as just pintos, prisoners, right?
Absolutely. And Victoria's saying, so she's asking, so safely dangerous for people who sometimes, I guess, sort of encounter it, which is an interesting, I guess, way of saying it. So how are you feeling? Because we were planning for an hour-long conversation. We've gone a little over, but if people have questions, is it all right if they can ask them? And then, so if people have questions, now's the time to get them in. I have a couple of things I'm going to talk to Alvaro about, but feel free. Now's the time. We're going to be wrapping up soon, so please. So now, is there an aspect, like, how would you fit this into the larger the sort of, because you look at Chicano and Latinx art in general, how would you fit this in terms of that larger art history? How do you see that? And are there any comparisons you make to help people understand what role this might play?
Again, I would stick it in there in the same way that you would, talk about surrealism or or any other kind of movement. It is formally, its own kind of tradition that continues on and is changed in its own right. So I would teach it right alongside, Mexican muralism or Chicano posters from the late '60s and the early '70s. It's part of the same concept, an ongoing changing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also an interesting comparison because they all have a type of narrative quality, or at least somewhat. Now, are there any abstract versions? Do those exist? Or have you?
There has to be, but
right? There has to be somewhere. But I mean, have you encountered anything that looks so that way? Or
no, everything is very, very deliberate and very, narrative, oriented, because at the end of the day, right, they're communicating, they're trying to say something. They're trying, right? These are people who have been robbed of their agency and their voice, and they're using this as a medium to express themselves. And so, yeah, it is very deliberate and very, it can seem very mysterious because, again, these are sort of very private conversations, and there's a lot of stuff that you just kind of don't quite get, like what they're saying. But they're also functioning within a kind of known vernacular. That's why you see like the same symbolism over and over and over again, the same kind of compositions over and over and over again. Because, again, I mean, that's how communication works. You can't make something abstract, because then people don't know what the heck you're talking about.
Makes sense.
But they must exist, and there certainly is room for it, because there's, one of the themes that I don't talk about, which is a kind of like psychedelia. Is something that comes up again and again, but the way that it's expressed is not abstract. They certainly show like fantastical monsters and weird things and dreams, and again, like the little bubbles and things like that. But again, it's all very deliberate, and it's all very, they're saying like, yeah, I'm kind of losing my mind in here, but at the same time, it's like they want to express the fact that they're losing their mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. Now, how about the institutions themselves that are collecting these, or that have amassed these collections? Now, how are they tending, or do they not know what to do with this material? Is that part of what the interests you, or how are they treating this material, or how are they exhibiting, if at all?
Well, I think for the most part, they're not. Maybe with the exception of the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, which just put out in October the opening of their the Rudy Padilla collection. Rudy Padilla is one of the most sort of honored collectors, and was a social worker, was a teacher, was a advocate for these guys for half his life, until he passed recently. And he had this huge collection that he donated for the most part to um, the Cultural Center, and another batch he gave to the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian has a few paños as well from the Rudy Padilla collection. But as far as the NHCC, they've been very consequent again about honoring him, having this big exhibition. I think right now it's the biggest exhibition that's ever put on, like 100+ pieces, which was wonderful to go and see the opening and meet some of these artists. Because again, I'm not familiar with like the New Mexico guys. I was familiar with some of the Texas guys. And so it was fun to go and see them and meet them. So they've been very consequent about, putting the word out and again, doing kind of what I'm doing, which is showing this stuff as art, right? We're talking about this as
Yeah,
these are artists and these are art pieces, right? These are art objects.
that's right.
That's the only way we can really perceive them as viewers. And so they've done a pretty good job of it. And again, trying to track down who these guys are, trying to contact their families. But a lot of it has to do because, Rudy Padilla did most of that work. I mean, he knew all these guys. He knew where these guys would give him these works of art for helping them, right? For and being with their families and all that kind of stuff. But otherwise, it's kind of a mixed bag. For the most part, it's the museums that have this in their collections can sort of step back and say, well, we just don't have the staff, to track down all this stuff, and and so yeah, no kind of nothing's going to happen until again, they put it on us, right? They're like, well, you're so interested, why don't you go and try, you go and track these guys down and see what we can do for them or not do for them or whatever, right? So yeah, there's nothing that's forcing any kind of provenance
Right.
on stuff. There's no legal reason for them to do it.
Hmm. That's interesting. And why do you think some of these institutions have accepted these as donations? If they don't have that context, why do you think that is?
Probably has to do with the donor more than anything. It's an important donor that they're not going to thumb their nose at someone, who has in the past given them money, given them artworks. And if these things are of nothing of particular importance to them, they're still going to take it.
Yeah. So, okay, let's see. Um, uh, oh, interesting. Somebody is actually reaching out. Hector, he mentions he's a formerly incarcerated artist with lots of work created in New York State prisons. And he's even sharing his email. So I'll share that with you in case that's of interest.
Please.
Happy to do that. So thank you, Hector, for mentioning that. Dory Goldman saying, when I taught high school in Texas, Central Texas and El Paso area, students often wore t-shirts with very similar imagery and compositions. So I'm wondering if you think that shirts are part of the Latinx vernacular, or if they may have actually been an actual adaptation, public version of these, or what you think those connections might be.
It's part of the larger Chicano vernacular.
Yeah.
You'll again, you find it on paños, the same kind of symbolism and compositions and forms. You find them on tattoos, on body art, as I said. You'll find it on car art. You'll find it in graffiti. So yeah, it's all kind of part of the same vernacular that's kind of informing, whether it manifests as a T-shirt or as a tattoo or as a paño.
Yeah. So Martha's people are getting into. I love how many people are into this. This is great. She's mentioning that LACMA and the Rachlin Murphy Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame have collections drawn by a New York City collector, and they were sourced by Ernest Martin of San Antonio. So just FYI, I'm going to send that to you too. So I love these. Please bring them all. These are all such great things. Then there's also Nicholas Gonzalez mentioned corridos versus prison art. I'm not quite sure what's the difference there.
Yeah, I actually did work a little bit on well, not corridos themselves, but certainly on uh narco art,
Got it.
which is kind of intertwined. Again, this whole there is a connection here, and I've talked about it in some of my articles, where there is this sort of tradition of, I think it's an American tradition, I don't think it's a Latin American tradition, of transgression, of lionizing transgressors, whether you're talking about, Pancho Villa or you're talking about El Chapo. And there's, these songs that glorify these guys but at the same time, there's also art,
Yeah.
that glorifies them and talks about them as being these, again, these kind of like Robin Hood, transgressive, figures. So yeah, I think there's a huge connection between narco art uh, and and baño art.
Hmm. And then someone's mentioning an upcoming exhibition at Nora Eckley's, what is it, Harrison Museum of Art?
Oh
Do you
yeah,
know?
that's me.
Yeah, that's you're there. Can you talk a little bit about? Oh, right, that's right. Now I remember. They're asking about that upcoming exhibition. Do you want to talk a little bit about that upcoming exhibition?
Sure. This is going to be, I guess, the second biggest exhibition of Banyo of Banyo art after the NHCC stole our thunder. But that's gonna be opening up in the fall, and it is
Now
for
you
the.
guys are in dialogue. How about that?
Oh yeah, no, they're contributing. They're contributing.
Well,
As long as it was below their number, we're okay. So yeah, they're contributing about 11 works from the Padilla collection. So we're very honored to have that. But for the most part, it's going to be that, and there's a couple of other collectors. The big, um, the majority of the pieces that are going to be in there. Again, it's going to be opening in August. Uh, is from the Renaud Le Platorti collection, who, as I said, is this French collector who's been a fantastic partner, and again also advocate, activist, all this kind of stuff. He really is incredibly passionate about these artworks, and again, he is not in it for the money. He's not in it for the fame. He really, and again, he oh, I didn't mention it before, but has also kind of puts his money where his mouth is. He works with prisoners in France in the prison system in Marseille, teaches them how to do baño art, art. And so yeah, so he's again very invested and passionate, and he's been a tremendous partner in this endeavor. So yeah, that's coming up in the fall.
absolutely. And what's the name of that show for the people so they can look out for it? Because someone's asking to post information about it. If you have a link somewhere, that would be great so people can kind of take a look.
Sure. I think they've updated it. It's called Artepaño / kerchief art.
Cool. So you can look out for that, Victoria. And if you have a link, please feel free to share it. And yeah, I mean, you've been so generous with your time. I appreciate it. Is there anything you want to bring up that perhaps we haven't touched upon that you think would be relevant for people? And then, but my last question after that is going to be: is there a part of this bigger artistic practice or this body of work, like perhaps there's a puzzle or a mystery you're still trying to solve? That you'd love to get in for more information on. Is there an aspect to this that you're still trying to unlock?
Um, not so much a puzzle as much as um, just to put this stuff out there, so that these artists can get in communication with me or their families. If they say, hey, I know who that is. That's my dad's work, or that's somebody, and again, right now, unfortunately, it's not about remuneration, but it's about recognition.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the way the law works, the sort of the sad cliche of possession being 9/10 of the law. Well, this applies to to the artwork as well. There's unless a museum is incredibly generous and lovely and would say, well, if you can prove this is so and so's work, we'll give you some kind of compensation or something or other. So again, I don't know how many museums are going to go ahead and do that. But again, what I'm trying to do is just again connect the people to the art, and what I was saying earlier about going to the exhibition in Albuquerque and meeting these guys and just seeing how incredibly proud they were. And I asked the curators, I said, did these guys ask for money? Or they're like, no, they didn't care about that. They just wanted, they were just so happy that that their names were on a wall and their artwork was in the museum, and they were just so proud, and they were there with their kids, and they were there taking photos in front of their artwork, and they were just so happy to be recognized as an artist, right? Not as a pinto, not as a Mexican dude who does art or whatever, but as an artist, right? And they were just so incredibly happy, and I would love to be making as many of those connections as I possibly can just by putting this stuff out there for people to see and for people to say, hey, I think I know who that is or who that's from. That kind of thing is what I'm kind of shooting for.
Yeah, and we've just I just posted a link. Thank you, Victoria, for surfacing that for us to the exhibition. So hopefully people will check it out. And will there be a publication?
Yes, there will be an exhibition catalog that's also coming out around the same time. So it's a small print, but again, if people are interested, I think if you contact NEMA, they'll be able to, get one in your hands.
So get your copies early. That's the moral of the
That's
story.
the moral of that story.
They're going to run out. Well, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. Is there anything you'd like to finish with, or anything you'd like to add?
Just just one more thing. A person has been incredibly helpful to help me wrap my brain around the sort of legal side of this, and I certainly wanted to give him a shout out. Bruce Riley, who is a previously incarcerated artist and lawyer, and he is also an advocate for prisoner rights, and he's fighting the good fight. But for those of you who are interested, his name is Bruce Riley, 2 L's, and you can find his endeavors at voiceoftheexperience.org. And he also has a really enlightening podcast called From Chains to Change.org. And you can hear, again, formerly incarcerated artists, musicians, talking about what they're trying to do with their art now that they're out, and again, also the problems with, how to reclaim, the stuff that was taken from them, all that sort of stuff.
Yep. Makes sense. And there's even somebody who's asking to interview you for their column. So I'll send you that afterwards, just so you know. So I just want to thank you so much for the generosity of your time, also for exposing us to this material and really making us think about the material both as an art object, but also the personal connection, which I think your exhibition really sort of helped many of us understand. I thought it was really powerful. And also just the lexicon, the sort of visual language these artists have created or used. And like you said, there's part of a larger tradition, but also a larger conversation with pop culture and different forms of art. And somebody brought up t-shirts and this kind of visual culture and material culture that's very much part of this discussion. So I want to say thank you so much for joining us and for taking part and being our first curator to talk as part of the fellowship. So thank you.
And I also wanted to thank you, Hrag and Lakshmi, your staff, everybody at Hyperallergic. Thank you for, giving me this platform for spreading the word.
Pleasure. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be posting this on YouTube later, and we're glad to be able to start challenging people to think about curation in different ways that are outside of the box. And I think this project definitely proves the possibility and potential for that. So thank you everyone, and enjoy your evening.